10 kilometers off the southern coast of Shanghai, sitting about 30 feet beneath the surface of the ocean, there is a fully operational data center. Not a data center near the water, not a data center cooled by water pumped in from the coast, but a sealed, pressurized facility physically resting on the seabed itself, running real workloads for real companies right now. In late May of 2026, this facility, built in Shanghai's Lingang special area, officially entered full commercial operation, and Chinese officials are calling it the world's first underwater data center powered primarily by offshore wind. On paper, sinking sensitive electronics into salt water sounds like the opposite of good engineering. In practice, this $226 million project claims to cut electricity consumption by nearly 23%, eliminate freshwater use entirely, and reduce land requirements by more than 90%, compared to a conventional data center doing the exact same job on dry land. So how do you actually keep a data center safe underwater? Why would anyone deliberately choose to build one there in the first place? And does this genuinely solve a problem the entire AI industry is currently struggling with? Let's get into it.
To understand why anyone would go through the trouble of building underwater in the first place, you need to understand just how much of a data center's total energy budget has nothing to do with actual computing. Every server rack packed with processors generates enormous amounts of heat as a simple byproduct of running calculations, and if that heat isn't removed constantly and reliably, the equipment inside overheats and fails within minutes. In a typical land-based data center, anywhere between 25 and 40% of total electricity consumption goes not toward the computing itself, but toward industrial chillers, air conditioning systems, and pumps, all working around the clock purely to move heat out of the building. On top of the electricity cost, most conventional data centers also consume large amounts of fresh water as part of their cooling process, putting them in direct competition with agricultural and residential water needs in the regions where they operate, an increasingly sensitive issue as data centers multiply worldwide to keep up with AI demand. As artificial intelligence workloads have exploded over the past few years, this cooling problem hasn't gotten smaller. It has become one of the single largest bottlenecks limiting how quickly new AI computing capacity can actually be built in almost every country racing to expand it.
The engineering insight behind an underwater data center is almost deceptively simple once you hear it explained. The ocean itself is already an enormous, naturally occurring heat sink, sitting right there, doing nothing, available for free. Instead of running expensive mechanical chillers to cool server racks, the Lingang facility circulates seawater through a sealed, closed-loop copper pipe heat exchange system. Heat generated by the servers transfers into this circulating water, which then dissipates that heat directly into the surrounding ocean, never actually mixing seawater with the electronics themselves, and never touching the servers directly. According to the project's developers, this seawater cooling approach alone reduces the facility's total electricity consumption by roughly 22.8% compared to an equivalent land-based data center, and it eliminates freshwater use for cooling entirely, since the ocean is doing that job instead. The facility's power usage effectiveness, a standard industry measurement of how much electricity actually reaches the computing hardware versus how much gets consumed by cooling and other supporting infrastructure, sits below 1.15, placing it among the most efficient large-scale data centers currently operating anywhere in the world. For comparison, many conventional enterprise data centers operate closer to 1.5 or higher, meaning a meaningfully larger share of their total power draw never reaches an actual computation.
Cooling is only half of this story. The other half is where the electricity itself comes from. The underwater modules sit deliberately positioned between the first and second phases of the Lingang Special Area's offshore wind farm, allowing the facility to draw power directly from nearby wind turbines, rather than depending primarily on the regional electrical grid. According to project developers, roughly 95 to 97% of the facility's total electricity comes from this offshore wind generation. That is a meaningfully different approach from simply building a data center and separately purchasing renewable energy credits on paper, a common practice among many technology companies elsewhere in the world.
Here, the physical wind turbines and the physical data center sit right next to each other in the same patch of ocean, drawing power through a direct, dedicated connection. This proximity also solves a practical problem that has limited offshore wind development in general: the challenge of efficiently transmitting large amounts of offshore-generated electricity back to shore over long distances without significant energy loss along the way. Placing the computing load directly next to the power generation sidesteps a meaningful chunk of that transmission problem entirely.
This is not simply an experimental research demonstration running idle test workloads. The facility currently houses nearly 2,000 servers across roughly 200 radiator-equipped racks, spread across 4 levels within its sealed underwater modules, with a total power capacity of 24 megawatts. GPU clusters from China Telecom and the domestic computing provider Linkwise have been deployed inside these modules, actively supporting real commercial workloads, including artificial intelligence processing, large-scale data annotation work, and the development of domestic Chinese large language models. The facility also supports coordinated allocation of computing resources between its underwater modules and complementary onshore data center facilities, allowing workloads to be balanced dynamically between the two environments, depending on demand and availability. Multiple Chinese companies have signed on as active operational partners on the project, including Shenergy Group, Shanghai Telecom, and China Communications Construction Company's Third Harbor Engineering Division, reflecting a genuinely broad, multi-company commercial commitment behind this facility, rather than a narrow, single-organization research pilot.
If underwater data centers sound like an unusually clever new idea, it's worth knowing that they aren't entirely new. Microsoft actually pioneered much of the foundational concept nearly a decade earlier through a research initiative called Project Natick, testing sealed underwater data center capsules first off the coast of California in 2015, and later in a larger deployment submerged off Scotland's Orkney Islands in 2018. Those Microsoft trials genuinely validated part of the core concept, finding that servers sealed inside a nitrogen-filled, oxygen-free underwater environment actually failed at a significantly lower rate than equivalent servers operating in conventional open-air data centers on land, likely due to the complete absence of corrosion, dust, and temperature fluctuation inside the sealed capsule. But despite those genuinely promising reliability results, Microsoft ultimately discontinued Project Natick by 2024 without ever moving it into full commercial deployment. China's approach differs from Microsoft's in one specific and important way. Where Project Natick focused primarily on proving out the underwater cooling and reliability concept in isolation, the Lingang facility deliberately integrates that same underwater approach directly with dedicated offshore renewable power generation from the very beginning, treating cooling and clean electricity as one single combined engineering problem rather than two separate ones. It would be misleading to present this as a fully solved, risk-free solution to the world's data center energy problem, and the project's own lead partners have been fairly direct about that. Wang Shifeng, chairman of Third Harbor Engineering, one of the companies directly involved in the project, stated plainly that construction of underwater data centers remains in its initial stage, and that further progress in both technological maturity and cost optimization is still required before the industry can move from demonstration-scale projects like this one to genuine large-scale application. Long-term maintenance is a particularly significant open question. When hardware inside a sealed underwater module eventually fails or becomes technologically obsolete, which happens routinely with servers every few years even on land, does the entire module need to be physically raised back to the surface for repairs, or can components be serviced and replaced without full retrieval? Neither the developers nor independent observers have offered a fully detailed answer to that question yet. There are also genuine unresolved questions from marine ecologists about the long-term thermal impact of continuously discharging server heat directly into a localized area of the surrounding ocean environment, an environmental consideration that simply doesn't exist for conventional land-based data centers.
Zoom out, and this project sits squarely inside one of the most urgent infrastructure challenges facing the entire global technology industry right now.
Worldwide electricity demand from data centers is projected to keep climbing sharply as AI adoption accelerates, to the point where individual proposed data center projects in the United States have already drawn public criticism for straining regional power grids, and in at least one widely reported case overseas, threatening to consume a share of an entire country's electricity supply just to operate a single facility. Multiple companies, well beyond China, are independently exploring similarly unconventional approaches to this same fundamental problem, including a Peter Thiel-backed American startup developing wave-powered floating data centers designed to operate far offshore. That parallel global interest is itself a strong signal that the underlying problem, how do you power and cool the physical infrastructure that AI increasingly depends on without straining electrical grids or freshwater supplies, has become urgent and expensive enough that multiple serious, well-funded teams around the world are independently willing to try genuinely unconventional solutions to solve it.
China's own ambitions for this approach extend well beyond the current 24-megawatt Lingang facility. Several of the companies already involved, including Shanghai High Cloud Technology, Shenergy Group, China Telecom, and China Communications Construction Company, have signed agreements to jointly pursue a considerably larger 500-megawatt offshore wind-powered underwater data center cluster, more than 20 times the capacity of the current operational facility. Whether that much larger, far more ambitious cluster actually gets built on the timeline currently being discussed will depend heavily on exactly the open questions raised earlier: maintenance economics over years of real-world operation, definitive long-term reliability data, and continued confirmation that the environmental impact on the surrounding marine ecosystem stays genuinely manageable at a meaningfully larger scale than what's running today. What's already clear, regardless of how that larger expansion ultimately plays out, is that the core underlying concept, submerging sealed computing infrastructure directly next to dedicated offshore renewable power generation, has now moved convincingly beyond a research lab curiosity and into genuine revenue-generating commercial operation, supporting real AI and cloud computing workloads today.
So here's the real question worth sitting with. For years, the default assumption in the technology industry has been that data centers belong on land, connected to the existing electrical grid, cooled by industrial air conditioning systems. If it turns out that the ocean itself, paired directly with offshore wind power, can solve both the cooling problem and the clean electricity problem simultaneously, and do it more efficiently than land ever could, how much of the world's exploding AI infrastructure ends up underwater within the next decade, rather than on it? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more grounded breakdowns of the infrastructure quietly being built to power the AI systems the entire world increasingly depends on, subscribe, because China's 500-megawatt underwater cluster is already reportedly in the works.